The primary thing I hear from survivors is shame and self-blame. When people process trauma on their own without bouncing it off of anyone is just cyclical, and it always comes back to blaming oneself. Recent research regarding how victims of sexual assault quantify and qualify what justice means to them, it's being believed and being acknowledged.
You can really accomplish anything if you feel that sense that your therapist is not trying to rush you through this, that they are with you. They're going to hold that space for as long as you need them to. They believe you and they're in for the long haul. They don't look at you as being broken. They look at you as somebody who has survived something significant. And here you are showing up, continuing, showing the courage and that bravery to step into hard things.
The part of my evolution that I'm the most proud of is my willingness to get uncomfortable and say yes to opportunities just like this one that I know have the ability to help someone.
You're listening to Amplify America, where we highlight social issues, the people affected by them, and the people working to find solutions to our nation's most persistent problems. I'm your host, April Yvonne Garrett. On this episode, I explore sexual violence and trauma in Alaska. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, forms of sexual violence include rape and sexual assault, child sexual assault and incest, sexual assault by a person's spouse or partner, unwanted sexual contact or touching, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation and trafficking, exposing one's genitals or naked body to others without consent, masturbating in public, watching someone engage in private acts without their knowledge or permission, and non-consensual image sharing. Sexual harassment, as defined by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, includes unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature in the workplace or learning environment. Further examples consist of making conditions of employment or advancement dependent on sexual favors, either explicitly or implicitly, physical acts of sexual assault, requests for sexual favors, verbal harassment of a sexual nature, including jokes referring to sexual acts or sexual orientation, unwanted touching or physical contact, unwelcome sexual advances, discussing sexual relations, stories, or fantasies at work, school, or in other inappropriate places, feeling pressured to engage with someone sexually, and unwanted sexually explicit photos, emails, or text messages. Sexual trauma is the lasting emotional, physical, or psychological effects from any sexual act inflicted on a person without their consent. Signs that you or someone you know is experiencing sexual trauma include continuing anxiety, severe mood swings, a sense of helplessness, persistent fears, depression, rage, sleep difficulties, eating difficulties, denial, social isolation, hypervigilance, reluctance to leave the house, sexual problems, difficulty concentrating, and numbing behaviors. Signs that someone you know is perpetuating sexual violence include they touch others inappropriately, they shame or coerce partners and others into sexual acts, they gaslight or make their victims doubt their reality, and they engage in sexual acts with people who are unable to consent due to their age, ability, intoxication, or other limiting factors. RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest Network, states that every 73 seconds, another American is sexually assaulted. 1 out of every 6 American women has been the victim of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience sexual violence at some point. Almost half of all victims of sexual violence in the United States were raped by an intimate partner. Ages 12 to 34 are the highest for sexual violence. From 2009 to 2013, Child Protective Services agencies substantiated that 63,000 children a year are victims of sexual abuse. The majority of child victims are between the ages of 12 and 17. Of victims under the age of 18, 34% are under the age of 12, and 66% are between the ages of 12 and 17. Approximately 70% of sexual violence victims experience moderate to severe distress, a larger percentage than any other violent crime. The majority of sexual assaults occur at or near the victim's home. 48% of victims were sleeping or performing another activity at home. 29% of victims were traveling to and from work, school, or running errands. 7% of victims were attending school. Sexual assault is a crime of power and control. It does not discriminate. It crosses all gender, race, age, and socioeconomic barriers. And it is not caused by or brought on by the victim. It is the sole responsibility of the perpetrator. On this episode, we examine sexual violence and trauma in Alaska with a tenacious survivor who uses her experience to empower others, an expert who meets the unique needs of sexual violence victims in that state, and a trauma therapist who helps survivors recover their power and reestablish agency over their lives. Blaze Bell is a singer, motivational speaker, holistic health coach, and podcast host. Her personal experience of trauma and addiction led her on a powerful healing journey. Blaze has turned her power into her purpose, and she now coaches others on how to reclaim their lives and heal from their past. She is the board president of Victims for Justice, the 2019 winner of the First Lady Volunteer of Alaska Award, and the creator of 4 signature programs centered on helping others rise up and heal.
I am Blaze Bell. I live in Anchorage, Alaska. I am a singer, a motivational speaker, a health coach, on and on it goes. But just really, I am here to serve.
Let's talk about your life in Anchorage before the assault. Who were you? What kind of person were you? How were you liking living in Alaska? And how were you a part of your community? How did you see yourself?
Oh, wow. So my assault happened at the age of 19. So it's hard to compare our stories with other people. It's hard to compare our journeys, who knows? But I was quite a happy-go-lucky kid. I've always been optimistic. I've been called aggressively optimistic, actually. So I was like the encouraging, bright side of life person. That being said, my father was an addict. He was not in my life. So that was really challenging. It was my mom and I until I was 12 or 13. It was just the two of us. So only child. And I also was very sick as a kid. So I had terrible asthma. I was in the hospital all the time. So that was a big part of my childhood as well. But I really outgrown a lot of that. And by the time I was a teenager, I was quite naive. Everything was like bright and shiny to me. I was just so excited all the time. Just, ooh, what's that? And what's this activity? So I did a lot of acting, a lot of dancing, a lot of singing, very artistic, and always trying to have a good time and figure out what's next. I never felt super connected to Alaska. I had posters of New York City on my wall growing up. So I was like, here we come, Broadway. So I always pictured myself in a big city. And now I picture myself on a beach. So that's the next phase of life. But I felt like I had a safe childhood. And other than the real discontent from my father not being around and the confusion that comes with that of addiction and not understanding that in childhood. But other than that, I felt good.
But now we're going to segue to the circumstances of your sexual assault. What can you tell us about that?
So I was 19 years old and I woke up with a masked man in my bedroom. And I'm never sure how much of this to share because I don't want to elicit pity from others. I also don't want to scare people. So that's a challenge for me. And you're welcome to ask me more in depth, and I will or won't go with that. But I will say, we can all imagine the absolute terror of waking up to that. And it felt like a movie. I didn't know that anything like that could ever be possible. So waking up to this masked man and what proceeded in that hour or so was so terrifying. He ended up beating me very badly when I tried to escape. I was quite religious at the time, and I remember yelling like, "In the name of Jesus, Satan, get out," like something my mom had taught me, and he didn't leave. So those kind of moments, my brain was rewiring every second. It felt like during that trauma where I was like, okay, God's not real. Next, okay, being a virgin means nothing. Next, okay, my home is not safe. Next, okay, men are evil. I was just like in that moment, everything changed in my brain. And I think that is such a huge challenge with trauma. I know that the reason I'm willing to share my story is because I'm not the only one. We each have unique parts on maybe what happened to us, but the feelings we have and the re-traumatization and what lingers, we all have that in common. I know this is an extremely underreported crime, and the reporting is very high. It's just so many of us suffering alone. So when that day, the bumps and bruises, the blood, I mean, it was extraordinarily violent. That's how I lost my virginity. He put a mask over my face. Like, there are so many details to it. It was very premeditated. It was not drug induced. Neither of us were drinking or on drugs. That wasn't an element of this. And then what followed was just more and more trauma, calling the cops. What happens next? How do I escape?
Well, let's pause for a second.
Okay.
So you're 19, you're in your home. Were you in your home with your family, or were you living alone or with roommates?
I lived with my family, but no one was home.
Got it. So this is the place where you grew up.
Yeah.
One of the questions I was going to ask you is if you recalled your state of mind before it happened, when it occurred to you that it was happening, during it, and then right after. And I think you started to get into that a little bit. You were asleep.
Yeah.
You're in your home, a place that you feel safe in, and you were asleep. You just had a normal night in your home before this all occurred, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'd actually been out with some friends and went and watched a movie. A guy I just started dating and his friends, and had a great night. And that was what I woke up to.
Mm-hmm. So this was someone you knew.
Yeah. And so in that moment, I had no idea who it was. But in the process of the police trying to find him, he actually attacked another woman about a week or two later, and she saw part of his face. And when they said his name, I said, "Oh, I know him." I'm not comfortable getting into those details because it's personal. It involves a lot more people than just me, unfortunately, and it's ongoing. But yes, most victims know their perpetrator, and though I didn't in the moment, yes, it was someone who knew me, and there are at least 6 known victims at this point.
Do you recall the moment when it ceased and then you got to say, what do I do next? What did you do when it ended so you could try to course correct? Because like you said, you're like, all of these things are happening in my brain. And I'm like, try that. That doesn't work. Believe that. That's no longer true for me. So as you're processing this, you get to the point where it's not an active situation. What do you do when it is no longer active? What course of action did you take?
Oh my God, my brain was going a million miles a minute. He had left, put me in a room and just said, "If you try to leave, I'll kill you." And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll spend the rest of my life in this room. But as I laid there, I was just going through my mind, what's my escape plan? How long should I wait? What am I going to do? And so I laid there and just planned, okay, I'm going to put those clothes on. I'm going to run outside. And I think there's a lady in the neighborhood who's a stay-at-home mom. So I'm going to go to her house because everyone else is probably at work. It felt like an eternity. I couldn't tell you. Time was moving in such a strange way. And so that's what I did. I very quietly got dressed, ran as fast as I could out of my house, went to the neighbor who I'll never forget the look on her face of seeing me. I hadn't seen myself yet, and I looked really scary. Running to her, "Are you safe? Where's your daughter? I need to call 911. And yeah.
So after you connected with this neighbor and she took care of you, what was your first contact with law enforcement like?
The police showed up very quickly. I called my parents, everyone was there. And again, it's a blur. It was so traumatic. It was such a crisis situation. I got my first glimpse of myself in the mirror and just was in complete shock of what I saw. Everything about it was terrifying. Quite a few agencies, day one, were there for me. And they all had different levels of knowing how to deal with victims, like trauma-informed care. That definitely wasn't across the board, yet they were all there to do their job and do it to the best of their ability. The police department was absolutely incredible, and they were working day and night on this case. They were able to link it back to previous cases that were unsolved. I remember my mom taking them gifts late at night because they were working 24/7 to try to find him and solve this.
How did that make you feel?
Amazing. I mean, I felt very cared for. I felt like 100% they were doing their job. and checking in on me. And there were quite a few other agencies as well.
What were those agencies?
STAR, which is Standing Together Against Rape, they showed up right away. And so I was taken to the hospital and I had to wait for a specific type of forensic nurse to come in and do a rape kit. And I remember laying on the floor in the hallway of the hospital, just wailing, just crying. I didn't want anyone to touch me. I didn't want my mom to touch me. No one knew what to do. Then this advocate from STAR showed up and she was so incredible. I can't remember what her face looks like. I don't know what her name was, but I remember her presence so strongly. And she was this barrier between me and the cops, between me and the doctors. And she knew what she was doing. She had my best interest. She didn't try to touch me. She just said, I'm here for you. I'm not going to let them ask you anything that's uncomfortable. She was this very powerful presence that was 100% there for the victim and knew how to talk to me and how to help others talk to me and treat me, which was amazing, really amazing.
When did you first interact with the court system around what happened to you, and what was that process like?
Oh man, I will say the justice system has been the hardest part of this whole experience. It's very clear to this day that the justice system seems to be set up for the perpetrators, not for the victims. And the re-traumatization has been so extreme with the way that court cases just get continued, and no one's thinking about me or all the different victims who are at home with so much stress and anxiety, preparing to show up at court, preparing to do these different things that take so much strength. And then, oh, by the way, we're continuing it. We'll do this again in a couple of months. And anyone who's gone through that system knows that. I don't know what it's like on the other side for the offenders, but that was very challenging. And then to this day, even with parole hearings and re-entry and all of these things, again, so completely set up with the perpetrator in mind, without there being a lot of support for, in my case, multiple innocent victims who are all saying, excuse me, why would you be releasing this person to the city we all live in? There's just so much illogical parts to this that don't seem to be of service to anyone involved.
Do you think that you interacted with anybody on the legal side of this that you felt was a strong advocate for your needs within the court system?
Yes, we had an incredible prosecutor in our case, and we ended up doing a plea deal. I was the only one of the group of us who was willing to speak at trial. And I totally trust that the way that went was how it was supposed to go, because I have no idea how absolutely heart-wrenching it could have been to go through a trial and be grilled by someone trying to tell me I was wrong. But that prosecutor was incredible. This is over 15 years ago at this point. So she now runs the Office of Victims' Rights here in Alaska. And she's so amazing. And so she fought so hard for us, and she still has shown up for us over a decade later at parole hearings and things.
What's her name?
Her name is Taylor Winston, and she is incredible.
Great. I'm really glad you had that experience. You said that you found advocates within the community in Anchorage that helped you through this. STAR sounds like one of them. Were there others?
Yes. So there's Victims for Justice, and I am now actually their board president, which is incredible. It's just a very full circle healing experience for me to be able to come back to them and say, you helped me when I couldn't help myself. I have done a ton of healing. How can I help you guys? They're an incredible organization. Their focus is more on victims of all violent crimes other than domestic violence and sexual assault. They deal with literally everything else, but a lot of these different agencies work together. They helped me file paperwork for the Violent Crimes Compensation Board, which is another incredible organization. And that group ended up paying my hospital bills, paying wages for the work I lost. Some of my family members' work they lost while they stayed home and take care of me. Years later, they paid for me to go to rehab. We were able to reapply over the years. One of the times when he was released from prison, they paid for us to go back to counseling. They paid for security systems for the house. I think that organization is amazing. The last thing you want in these scenarios is to go, okay, I'm dealing with the biggest crisis of my life, and now I can't work, and now I lost my job, and I have no money, nobody's here to support me. And so they help take that burden off, which I think is really incredible.
It is incredible. I'm so happy to hear that you had that resource for you. Tell me how you were treated by loved ones and friends and your community at large after this happened.
I think a lot of people were tiptoeing around me, understandably. They didn't know what to do. The magnitude of certain things about my case were beyond what a lot of people had ever dealt with before. So I mentioned rehab. One of the things was right after this happened, all of a sudden I was surrounded by doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists, and they all just handed me a whole bunch of prescription drugs. And so I went from nothing to having pain pills, anti-anxiety meds, sleeping pills, antidepressants, all at once. And I now know how incredibly strong those types of drugs are. And that became a huge problem. But again, that was one of those things where it was like, nobody knew what to say. They didn't know what to do. So they're like, try this, take that pill and see what happens. And I didn't have any coping skills at that point in my life. I had a cousin who flew up as soon as she heard. She left her kids and husband at home in Oregon, came up and just said, I'm here. And she would try to make me laugh. Everyone kind of did their own way of, how can I support you? Is it distracting you? Is it being a shoulder to cry on? Is it listening? I think everyone does their best, but I think it's a really tough situation.
Given what you know now from all your advocacy work and your evolution, what would you say to them or folks who are around other survivors about how their behaviors and how their support could have been more helpful?
I think the best thing we can do for someone is listen to them. And sometimes it's really as simple as that. And we don't need to solve everyone's problems. And I think when it comes to sexual assault, it's such a challenging thing to talk about. Nobody wants to hear the word rape. No one wants to say it. And that's why I think one of the reasons is perpetuated so much. So I think just being so open and willing to listen, because what I want for other survivors is for them to have one person that they can talk to. And we don't want to go to someone who's going to immediately say, I'm calling 911. We're going to the police station right now. Do this, do that. Go meditate, go pray. We don't want to be bossed around, and we don't want to be put into a position that might be even more traumatizing. We just want someone who will listen and be next to us. Then if the person you're with is very affectionate, some people want that affection. Other people don't really want to be touched. There can be a real disassociation with your body after going through something like that. But I always wanted someone there, even when I didn't want to be touched.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You talked about the immediate impact after it happened. How did you navigate all of that? What did you do? What were some of the challenges you faced? And what aspects of those challenges were most pronounced as you were coming out of it? You have all these people who are trying to care for you. And then you're trying to process who you are and how to be after this really traumatic experience. You alluded to this a little bit where you're like, they just handed me all this medication. And that started another journey. And I know in our previous conversation, you talked a little bit about the fact that people didn't know how to handle you. So in some ways, they unwittingly possibly enabled you. So could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah. So in the days, months, years that followed, it's so incredible how long it can take to heal from something like that, depending on what healing looks like. Early on, I remember thinking, okay, I can handle this. I'm going to be a voice for women. Now I know my mission on earth. I have all this brand new empathy I've never had. And I felt very focused. And then my biological father, who I had mentioned before, who's an addict, he died. And then my stepfather left my mom. And that all happened within like a 9-month period. After that, I was like, I need a break. I need a break from reality. I have no clue how to handle this much emotion. And again, I think a lot of us go through that where it's just one thing happens and then another, then another. And we still haven't figured out how to deal with the first thing. That's like this checkout point. I was never suicidal. Oh, coming back to you saying how to help someone. There was a counselor I had in the beginning of this who heard my story and she said, oh my gosh, I can't believe you haven't tried to kill yourself. Or I can't believe you're not suicidal. It was one or the other, but
Wait. That happened right after the incident?
This was like a counselor I was sent to process this. And I saw in that moment her face, you know, that face where you're like, did I just say that out loud? And I remember thinking, oh man, well, my only issue is like abusing some of these drugs. I'm not suicidal, so I'm fine. And I clearly don't want to go to counseling. For all the amazing therapists out there, please don't say that to anyone.
Right, please don't.
Point being, I was not suicidal, but I wanted to check out badly. I wanted a break. So I turned to the only thing I knew, which were these prescription drugs that sometimes made me feel loopy and made me feel carefree. That set me on a path of addiction, and that led to other things. And then I turned 21 and started drinking, and it just snowballed into this just full-blown drug and alcohol addiction. And it was all I had. That's not true. I also had an eating disorder. And I think that's important to talk about too, because I later on read that almost all victims of sexual abuse, molestation, sexual assault develop an eating disorder and an addiction. And I was textbook doing that. Those two things were hand in hand, and they were a huge part of my life for nearly a decade. Finally, I got clean at the age of, I believe, 28 or something. I'm coming up on 10 years. Clean and sober, 10 years free of my eating disorder.
I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you, what was that turning point for you where you were like, this is not a life that I can live any longer?
Wow. There were a lot of little things. And one of the big things, though, was I was at a point where I finally had some things to lose. And I think it's hard when you don't have a lot to lose.
What were those things?
Those things were a child. I had stayed clean through my pregnancy. So I got pregnant, and it was on purpose. We were like, let's have a kid. But I got pregnant right away. I remember being drunk, reading the pregnancy test the morning after a big night. And
how old were you?
Oh, I think 27. I don't know, somewhere between 25 and 29. And 2011, he was born. So I remember just being like, okay, fun. Okay, I'll be pregnant. Obviously, pregnant people don't drink and kids are fun and this will be great. I quit that day and stayed sober, clean through the whole pregnancy, which of course I was a bit of a nightmare because imagine taking away my only coping skill and then adding pregnancy hormones. And it was just a whole thing. But I got through it. I had my son a week later. And then I thought, well, obviously I'm not an addict. I just went 9-10 months. I'm fine. I can drink normally now, right? So went and had a drink, and I was like, let's have a glass of champagne and celebrate. And one drink, and it was like tunnel vision. I knew in that moment, nope, I can't do this. And I had a couple months there where I was not getting drunk, but I was drinking, and it was just reverting to some of these sneaky behaviors and secretive, planning out like, timing with breastfeeding when I could have a drink and doing all this research and what can I take that's not going to hurt the baby, and it was just pure insanity. It's a horrible thing to talk about. It feels very bad. I still have some shame and guilt around that. A couple of months later, their dad said, if you want kids in your life, you can't do this ever again. And I didn't. And it was one of those where he was extremely calm, which is always so much scarier than when someone's just yelling at you. It's like, oh, you're serious. So from there, I did everything differently. I went far out of my comfort zone. I knew that my brain didn't work right. And my first thought was never going to be correct, at least for a while, until I learned something new. So I joined an only women's addiction group because I didn't have any female friends at that point. I was a bit uncomfortable around women. So I did it. I did everything suggested. And at a certain point, I also decided I'm going to put as much time, money, and energy into my healing as I put into my addiction, into my self-destruction. And I'm still paying, still really deep diving into healing. And I love it so much.
Were there any experiences or major connections you made with any kind of modalities that really just showed up in your life when you were going through this and trying to get to the healing, that you just were like, this is a path for me. This is really good. I recommend this to anybody who's trying to deal with this kind of trauma?
Oh, yeah. There are a lot. And I think one of the great things today is that we have so much access to healing. When I was a kid, my mom didn't have the kind of access that I have now that I can share with my kids. My first recommendation is to get into that space of willingness to try new things. I remember not being willing. Oh, that's weird, or that's woo-woo, or new agey people are weird. I'm not going to do that, And now I'll try just about anything for healing. A few things I recommend highly to assault victims is tapping. It's also called EFT, emotional freedom technique. This is one of the absolute best things that exist for healing PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a tricky thing to heal. And so I was so excited when I found this, and I use it almost on a daily basis at this point in my life. But if you go on YouTube and Google tapping, EFT, Brad Yates is an amazing resource, Gala Darling, there's a lot out there. And it's basically a combination of neuroscience and acupressure, and you tap on certain points and clear all kinds of energy with whatever you're dealing with in the moment. So tapping, number one. Hypnotherapy, I find extremely powerful. And there's lots of science backing up how much more quickly it works than talk therapy, because in hypnotherapy, you're going straight to your subconscious mind. And that's the tricky part, is when we go through this abuse, especially when we're talking about maybe something that happened in childhood that you've never dealt with, you've just suppress, ignore it. It's still locked in there somewhere. And our subconscious mind dictates like 90% of our actions, and we don't even realize it. And so now you are acting out in the world based on some childhood abuse, and you consciously don't realize it. I could talk about that all day, but I think it's so powerful to go back and do some hypnotherapy with a trained hypnotherapist and work through breaking down what's stuck back there. Jordan Rystrom is the queen of that. There's a lot of help out there, some free, some you make an investment, but it's there.
When you started going down that path to try to figure out what would work for you, did you consult other people, or how did you do your deep dive into that?
Oh, yes, I consulted all kinds of people. This is probably the first time in my life where I turn away help a little bit more than I ask for it. I'm at a point now where the message is always, just connect with your higher self, like, you know what you need to do, and you'll get more distracted by listening. But for 10 years, I took in a lot of information, and I'm so glad I did. Because of my addiction, my healing started with 12-step meetings, and there are a lot of different versions of those going on. I think they're amazing for support. If you don't have anyone in your life that understands you or is there for you, go to a meeting. There'll be a room full of people that will embrace you. So I think support-wise, it's really amazing. And it helped me release some shallow top layers of what was going on. I no longer do 12-step meetings, but I did that for probably 2 to 3 years in the beginning. But then I kept seeking more and more. Also, reach out to mentors. Even if you think they're way too big of a deal for me, worst case scenario, they won't reply. But I've been able to connect with people all over the world. There's so many online courses that you can take. There's so many free videos on YouTube where people are truly trying to serve and add value to other people's lives. Podcasts, so many great podcasts, meditation, mindfulness techniques that are very simple but very effective. I met a life coach. I did life coaching with her, which I really loved. That was a different spin where it was very goal-based and let's talk about this year. What are we going to do? I ended up going to nutrition school and becoming a holistic health and wellness coach, and just absolutely love that. I just kept going. I kept going. As things came up, I would say yes. I did a lot of saying yes until I got burnt out, and then I did a lot of saying no. But I think it's important. We all are on this journey. You're the main character in your story. So what are you going to do today? What do you want your main character's life to look like? You can create that.
Right. What part of your evolution are you most proud of?
No one's ever asked me that. I think the part of my evolution that I'm the most proud of is my willingness to get uncomfortable and say yes to opportunities just like this one that I know have the ability to help someone. And that's really hard. And like even right now, like I'm a little shaky. I could probably cry at any moment. I just shared some deeply uncomfortable things with you. I don't know you personally, about the worst day of my whole life. Sorry.
Don't be. You are a gift.
But I'm proud of myself. I'm proud of myself for being willing to do that. because I know that there is a girl somewhere who is alone, who's alone in her room right now, and she's scared, and she feels powerless, and she feels disconnected from herself, and she thinks she's alone in her pain and alone in her struggle and alone, and she isn't sure what to do. And I know that when I share my story and when I share my healing, that someone out there will know that they're not alone, and it can give them some hope that maybe they too can heal. Maybe they too can reclaim their power, find their strength again through their vulnerability, and come out on the other side so much stronger than they ever knew they could be.
I gotta pivot. You okay? Okay. I think you just answered the next question, which was, what would you like to share with other survivors? Well, a big question, especially given what you went through tactically with all of this, is what policies should we advocate for on behalf of sexual assault victims and survivors? It sounds like you got a lot of experience with that and lots to say.
I do. I'm so glad you're asking about that. Again, the justice system has been so incredibly tough to navigate as a victim. And one thing that has been so clear is that victims aren't often trying to advocate for themselves. I think that's partly why there isn't more in place. And I think that one of the unique things about my case is that there's a group of us. And so I feel like had any of us just been on our own, we probably wouldn't have done as much as we've had the strength to do together. But that really opened my eyes to some real missing pieces. I'm in Alaska. Now I'm in like the big city of Alaska, but there's some real problems we have here in our villages. And there are these small village communities around the state of Alaska where abuse is rampant. And it brings me back to the number one issue I've been having, which is, why are you taking repeat violent offenders and putting them back into the town where their victims are? The one town that I don't think they should be. And I feel every time I've spoken to someone about this, everyone's logic goes, yeah, that makes no sense. Not only for those of us who are afraid, and again, we come back to the re-traumatization. Now we're living in fear, and depending on where you are in your own evolution, it can be absolutely terrifying. Now you're taking these people who are a positive part of your community and putting them into unnecessary fear for this one person who has hurt so many people. Why are we doing that? And the answer I've been given more than once is, well, there's bleeding heart people who don't believe in banishment. Now, I understand that to a point, and I don't know where we would banish people to. And I'm sure that's probably the place everyone stops when we talk about this. It's like, well, where do we send them? Or what if they have a family member in that town? And I get that. But I'm hoping maybe there's someone listening to this who has the connection, the institutional knowledge, power, and passion. I will be with you to figure out how to make exceptions to these laws. Because again, I'm specifically talking about repeat violent offenders. Here I am in my situation where I'm in a town of 300,000. I don't have to see this person every day. But when you're talking about these villages, and we have this huge thing that thankfully is getting so much global recognition of the Indigenous women who are being abused and murdered, and more light is being shined on that. And I'm so glad. And that's one of these issues, is now you're just sending these guys back to this small community where you can't go a day without seeing each other. And from the perpetrator's perspective, now you're putting this person who has something wrong with their brain, and you're putting them back into the most triggering place you could put them, where they're going to drive down the street and see a bunch of different places where they've committed these heinous crimes. That's definitely going to trigger something in them. Also, if they see any of us, they could go right back to prison. It just doesn't make sense. It makes me so upset, because I can't find the logic. And I feel like there must be a way to not let this be so.
Right. Well, complimentary to that, because it's always important for me to ask people what kind of policies they want to see to protect and support survivors. And I also personally believe in restorative justice, but I think that it's really important for us to have the structure where that can happen, where people can get the help. Like you said, something happened with them. They're not going to get that structure change within the carceral system. So how do we get these people to reacclimate in a way where they can be healthy members of society? But if you're talking about a repeat offender, how do you handle that? We do need to unpack that, figure out what the causes are and the cost. I'm glad that you said that, because it's important to hear from somebody who's experienced it. The other part of this is I think that people want to figure out how to show up for other people. What does a prime volunteer opportunity look like in this particular space?
Yeah. So STAR, which is Standing Together Against Rape, they have a 24/7 crisis line, and they do volunteer training. Also, no matter where you are in the world, you can call this crisis line. 2020, they were getting calls from all over the nation. People saying the crisis line in their town was too busy and they called here and got to talk to an advocate. If this mission is on your heart, that's one thing that's incredible. Go through the training, pick up a crisis line shift once a month, a few hours, or whatever that looks like that could work into your life. You'd be surprised how helpful it is, especially some of these organizations that are smaller. You taking 3 hours to come help with something can be absolutely amazing. Find your local organization and give them a call, shoot them an email and say, I'd like to volunteer some time, or how can I help? Nowadays, there's influencers on social media. That's a big thing too. And once in a while, I'll have somebody say, hey, Blaze, can you just promote my thing on your Instagram page or do a story about it? Someone who has some type of influence, even just doing a shout out, can get more eyes on their project. Just do it from your phone that you're on all day anyway, and give a little shout out to a local cause.
My last question for you is, what is the core value Americans should hold when it comes to sexual assault?
Acceptance. I think acceptance of victims, acceptance of holding space for them to share their stories, and holding that space in silence. We see this a lot where people get into really murky waters when they feel like they have to clap back at a victim and say, well, why were you out late? Well, were you drinking? Well, what were you wearing? It's still happening. And it's absurd. I think some silence and an open heart. People aren't leading with their heart anymore. A lot of people are just in this reactive mode for their own reasons, but we really need to be opening our hearts to other people and going, how would I feel in their position? What if I was drinking? What if I was trying to get attention that night, but then this thing happened to me? How would I feel? Would I feel like that was my fault? No, absolutely not. I would feel in deep shame, pain, and trauma, and I would just want somebody to hold me and be there for me. And we need to be that person for our fellow woman, for our fellow man, for our fellow humans, being there to hold space and care for them, just care for each other.
I don't know that I have the words to express my deep appreciation for you sharing today. This is a very difficult topic for a lot of people, most of all people who have experienced this. And it was very important for me in the structure of this show that whenever I talk about an issue, I engage the audience with a human being, flesh and blood, that has had this experience, because I think you're right that we lack empathy for other people. But I'm grateful that you pushed through this and shared that, because you're going to embolden someone else to pay attention in a way they haven't paid attention before. I'm really inarticulate right now because I'm very, very emotional, but I am so grateful for you, because you, in the space of all of this, still occupy your humanity with so much joy and optimism and a sense of like, this thing happened to me, but it will not define me. And I feel like you literally have transmuted this trauma into treasure. And that is the gift of who you are. This is a very important part of the history of this project. So I can't thank you enough for just being open and vulnerable and sharing your story with me and with this audience. It's just great to have another reflection of a human heart in the world that makes you feel seen. So thank you.
You're welcome.
You're listening to Amplify America with April Yvonne Garrett. Support Amplify America by becoming a monthly patron at patron.podbean.com/Amplify America or making a one-time donation via Cash App or Venmo by searching Amplify America. For more information, please visit amplifyamerica.com. The state of Alaska has the highest rates of sexual assault in the nation. News headlines featuring elected officials, tribal leaders, and other prominent community members involved in sexual misconduct have been a constant over the past few years. Additionally, the sexually predatory behaviors of some Catholic priests have caused decades of devastation in Indigenous communities across the state. Keeley Olson is the executive director of STAR Alaska, Standing Together Against Rape. Since 1978, STAR has been responding to the needs of survivors of sexual assault while integrating prevention and education programs to reduce harm to all Alaskans.
My name is Keeley Olson, and I'm the executive director of STAR, Standing Together Against Rape, based in Anchorage, Alaska.
What is the mission of STAR?
The mission is to prevent sexual trauma and provide collaborative, cooperative advocacy and support to survivors, victims, their family and loved ones, in our communities.
Can you tell us what sexual trauma is and what it actually involves?
Sexual trauma runs along a continuum of a variety of different types of unwanted sexual contact. It can include grooming of children to make them more vulnerable to harm and sexual abuse, sexual harassment in the workplace, sending people images of a sexual nature without their consent, touching someone in a sexual manner, sexual comments that are unwanted, sexual trafficking, human trafficking for the commercial use of sex. It can be taking advantage of the youth who are homeless and subverting their needs for shelter or food, for example, by trading sex for those kinds of commodities.
Can you do me a really good favor of telling the audience what your definition of sexual harassment is?
Sure. Anything that is of a sexual nature that is in the workplace. It can be sexual discrimination. It can include quid pro quo or an exchange for sex for something having to do with their job. Anything that ties someone's employment to sexual favors or someone's sexual gratification, it runs the gamut. We certainly have a lot of very high-profile cases of that nature here in Alaska. We've had a couple of attorneys generals. We just had the leader of our tribal health consortium that was accused of sexual harassment. You're seeing it with Cuomo in New York right now with numerous allegations of sexual harassment. It can be your boss sending you unwanted pictures, asking you to work late, having you go out to dinner as a work function, or impacting what kind of clothing you wear at work. It usually starts with testing boundaries and then escalates from there to accumulation of the offender getting power and control over the person that they're harassing.
When people think about sexual trauma, I think they want to consider the dynamics at play. What is it that you want people to understand?
Similar to domestic violence, it's about power and control. Subverting someone for someone else's needs, taking advantage of vulnerabilities. It isn't about someone who can't help themselves from causing harm. It really is subjecting someone to power and overcoming them. I think a lot of people consider real, true sexual assault is fully completed rape, generally done by a stranger to the victim who has done something to make themselves vulnerable by walking down a dark alley and a stranger jumps out and attacks them. And that's really what we have to overcome, particularly with juries in criminal cases. It's not generally a stranger to the victim. It is very traumatic, even if it doesn't arise to a level of sexual violence. Harassment in the workplace can be incredibly traumatic and life-changing and affect someone's ability to provide for themselves in a way that they choose. and cause fears of putting themselves in those kinds of situations again. And that never has to involve touching. We really need to broaden people's understanding of what sexual trauma is and what causes sexual trauma.
How does that look in Alaska and in Anchorage with the population that you are tending to every day?
In Alaska, we have nearly 4 times the national rate of sexual violence than any other state in the nation. Nearly half of the women in this state have experienced sexual abuse. That is based on research that has been done for the last several years by the University of Alaska in Anchorage. Every 5 years, they do a traumatization survey where they interview women across the state and talk with them, not about asking them if they've been sexually assaulted, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand what that terminology means, but they ask them about behaviors that they've been subjected to. Has anyone ever kissed you without your consent? Has anyone ever touched you in an inappropriate manner? Has anyone ever held you down and forced you to have sex against your will? And based on the responses that they get, we know that half of the women in our state have been subjected to either domestic violence, sexual assault, or both in their lifetimes.
It's interesting that when the University of Alaska at Anchorage did this harm study, the questions that are being asked of people, they don't even realize these acts could be considered acts of sexual aggression or sexual trauma. What are some of those things that you mentioned that people don't even consider? I didn't even realize that this was an act of sexual aggression or sexual violence.
I think a lot of people don't recognize grooming techniques and strategies that have been used on them. They may not consider harm that happened to them as a child or a youth as being child sexual abuse. If they have had prior trauma, then they may have difficulty understanding the boundaries of what's normal in relationships. So if they have been on a date with a man, for example, and they say no, but the person persists and they end up having sexual intercourse, that person may not feel like a victim. They may feel like this is just how it is. This is what relationships are like. A lot of people consider if they know the person, if they're close with them, or even if they've been in a relationship with them, that it's not sexual assault. They think of someone jumping out behind a bush in the dark and attacking. If that hasn't happened to them, they don't classify themselves as a survivor.
When you talk about grooming, people may not be aware they're being groomed. How would you classify that for the audience?
Grooming is generally a terminology that's used when talking about the precursors to child sexual abuse, but it can happen to adults as well. In regards to children, it will be the only kind of affection or care that is shown for the child is being alone with them, telling secrets, becoming a confidant to the child, asking them to touch the adult in an appropriate manner that break down barriers and put them in their own little world. With adults, it's more along the lines of someone who doesn't accept no, who continuously pushes the edge of the envelope and sees how far they can get with someone until eventually that leads to sexual assault.
What are the demographics of the people you're seeing, and what does that tell you about how sexual trauma is showing up in society?
Here in Alaska, we have a large population of Alaska Natives that are highly over-victimized in regards to sexual trauma. The primary demographic that we serve are white Caucasian women. After that, the next highest demographic are Alaska Native women. Over a third of the people that we serve are Alaska Native women, and they only make up about 8% of the population in Anchorage. That gives you an indication of the fact that they are singled out and victimized. Racism plays a part in that, as well as historical trauma. About 10% of the people that we serve are adult men. Something that a lot of people don't understand is that sexual violence does not discriminate. Anyone can be vulnerable.
What is the role of historical trauma and its impact, not just on Alaskan Natives, but also on the young people there?
When we talk about historical trauma, we are talking about traumas that have been visited upon the Alaska Native cultures. It's colonialism, the experience of missionaries and Catholic priests coming to Alaska, and what we have only recently learned, while we knew that Catholic priests were responsible for sexual abuse of sometimes 90% of people in rural Alaska villages. We didn't understand that if they'd been abusive in communities in the lower 48, the Catholic Church punished them by sending them to remote villages where they had free reign and no oversight. And there have been several documentaries, several class action lawsuits arising from the sexual abuse that occurred throughout Alaska. And it's bankrupted some Catholic churches as a result. But there was no word in Alaska Native cultures in their language for rape. Along with that, there was an effort to kill their culture, to make them more white, to make them more American. They removed all of the youth from the villages and sent them to remote boarding schools. They refused to allow them to speak their language, to dance their dances, to sing their songs, to have their religion. That resulted in these children being completely isolated and separated from their culture. Then when they returned home, they couldn't talk to their parents. They couldn't communicate with their grandparents. They couldn't benefit from the resilience of culture, and they were caught in between. They weren't really accepted by the dominant white culture, and they weren't accepted back at home. They didn't really have a home anymore. So they were lost, easily susceptible to the victimization of priests and other white colonialists that brought in and introduced sexual violence, something that they had never known before. When that was introduced, they didn't have any connection within their communities to get power. They found other ways to exert power. Unlike a lot of states in the lower 48 with high populations of Native Americans, maybe living on reservation land, while they have a high incidence of domestic violence and sexual assault as well, they tend to be taken advantage of by white male offenders. Here in Alaska, particularly Western Alaska, those demographics are a little different. The offenders are just as likely to be Alaska Native than they are white. Again, it's that completely being cut off from their culture that has created traumas that have been visited upon the sons and daughters for generations. There is a lot of work being done in resilience and culture appropriation to learn more about their cultures, to regain language. And those are all really hopeful prevention measures that are being taken. It has to be done with a lot of forethought, a lot of will. We have a huge number of Alaska Natives that are incarcerated in our state, looking at some models of justice that are more appropriate to their culture, that take into consideration their means of living being subsistence and living off the land. That also prompts a lot of people to keep secrets in rural villages, because the person who is the great whale hunter or gets all of the caribou for the village is abusing his power and is a sexual predator. And people don't talk about it because they value that he is the biggest provider in the community. So they are at risk if something happens to him. There are a lot of communities where sexual violence is kept secret. That goes for a lot of demographics, right? But historically, it has been more difficult for Alaska Natives because they never had a word for rape. The term bother really is the closest word. We train our crisis line responders to read between the lines, to understand what they're talking about when someone is either grooming them or sexually abusing them. They may not overtly be able to express in words what's happening, but we can talk about what some of the behaviors are.
When you have a person that is facing this type of trauma and they come and access your organization for help, how do you begin to help them navigate the process of facing it and then reporting it?
We get about 4,000 calls on the statewide sexual assault crisis line a year. People call for a variety of reasons. Some people just want to talk to know about their reporting options. Some are needing medical assistance and wondering how they go about getting it. We meet them wherever they are and find out what their needs are. We want to put them in the power seat. We let people share with us what they feel comfortable sharing. We're not investigators. We're not fact finders. We don't need the details. We don't need to interrogate anyone. We're simply there to listen and help direct them in the direction they want to go. It has very little to do with the experience of what happens to the offender.
Does STAR actually provide in-house resources, or are you referring?
We provide advocacy and support in the form of individual support sessions. Those generally take about an hour where we meet with people and talk about what their needs are. We provide direct advocacy when someone is choosing to report a crime, and it is possible to have law enforcement come take a statement from them at our office. We are present with them when they do so. That initial statement may lead to a sexual assault response team, which is the best standard of care available internationally. Is a multidisciplinary model where advocates, law enforcement, and forensic nurses come together and wrap services around a survivor. So if they are choosing to report within a time frame of 5 days, where it's deemed that evidence on their body or their clothing may be probative, then we come together for a SART, sexual assault response, if they're open to doing so.
When I interviewed Blaze, we talked about that and how critical that was for her to have the advocate there, knowing that there was somebody there expressly for her, who was the buffer between her and law enforcement and the medical and all of that overwhelming space. It just calmed her nervous system down enough so that she could get through what she needed to get through. Can you explain the positionality of the advocate and how they're working in tandem with these folks and what your relationship really looks like in Anchorage? Because I know in different places, some relationships are wonderful, and then some relationships can be tricky because of all the different dynamics.
In Anchorage, the sexual assault response team is primarily made up of STAR advocates, the Anchorage Police Department, and Forensic Nursing Services of Providence. We have our very own specialized clinic that is only for sexual assault survivors for this purpose. It is in a beautiful multi-million-dollar center dedicated to child sexual abuse and sexual assault survivors. It's comprised of 2 separate private suites. Each has an interview room and a main room, a comfortable space with a couch, coffee maker, food. We provide all the clothing. Generally, when someone comes in, their clothing is collected as evidence, and so we replace all of their clothing. It's got its own private medical examination room and a bathroom with a shower for them to get cleaned up after everything is over, which most people are looking forward to that from the time they come in. So on one end of those suites, one end of that hallway is where our Anchorage Police Department Special Victims Unit is located. They're co-located. The forensic nursing team is at the other end of the hallway. And as advocates, we're the only ones who travel to that space. We are generally the first ones there, maybe along with the nurse. We provide an overview of what the SART response will look like. We make sure to let the survivor know that they are in charge. We will take as long as they need. They can take as many breaks as they want. They can walk away at any point in the process. They can refuse anything that is offered to them. We just want to make sure, first and foremost, that their body is okay, that they're able to recognize that they are believed, that we care for them, that they are treated with compassion and dignity, and they have a right to say no to anything, and we accept their no because that has been taken away from them. So we want to instill that as the primary goal, is that they're in charge of what happens. We have a very trauma-informed detective team, and we explain to them why they're asking the questions that they're going to ask, that it's not an interrogation, that they need really detailed information. And the medical team is there to ask some questions as well, but we will try not to ask them over and over again. We want to make sure that they only have to tell their story one time, which is why we all come together and we're all present to hear their story, so that if they're describing what happened or where they were touched, for example, that cues in the forensic nurse to know where to collect evidence, where to swab. Generally, the perpetrator is a male. If he licked their neck, she'll know to swab right there. And we instill with them that the law enforcement isn't asking about drinking or drug use because they're blaming them. They're really seeking to know what all of the elements surrounding what occurred. And the more that they can share exactly what happened, the less likely it is that the defense can try to use something like that against them. It might help determine what level of sexual assault it would fall under as a first degree, second degree, third degree sexual assault based on the kind of contact that is had, or whether someone was intoxicated and incapacitated and not able to make sure that they could fight someone off. And the nursing staff are really there to make sure that they don't have long-term consequences to their body, such as a pregnancy that results. We want to make sure that they have access to Plan B. We want to make sure that they have access to medical prophylactics that will prevent them from having sexually transmitted infections. We want to make sure that if they have any injuries, that those injuries are being treated, not just documented for the sake of evidence, and that we schedule follow-up so that we can make sure that they are getting the kind of treatment that they need. We want to make sure that, for example, if they've been strangled, which is very frequent and very common, it almost goes hand in hand with domestic violence and sexual assault, that they're getting the kind of treatment that they need and being evaluated at the hospital.
Is this a standard that has been applied nationally? Is this something that you're doing really well in Anchorage? I love the concept of having all of that happen in one place so they don't have to do this over and over again. It seems that when you're trying to get people to report something that has been exacted upon them that's trauma-inducing, it's hard enough for them to deal with that in the moment. Is this something that's becoming more of a standard practice?
It is accepted as the best standard of care. But I'm surprised often at how advanced we are here in Anchorage. And I think it's a matter of ingenuity by necessity, right? We've had to get really good at responding to sexual assault because we have so much of it, unfortunately. I think that it's been very specialized here in Anchorage. STAR's been around for 42 years, and we were a founding member of the SART starting. We still have the same clinical supervisor who started the SART program. We have a very specialized team in the Special Victims Unit. We also work with the Crimes Against Children of Anchorage Police Department. We've got specialized troopers who have the responsibility for all the rural areas of the state that don't have their own local law enforcement. There are other areas of the state that don't have SART teams, and generally will transport them to Anchorage or Fairbanks. But I think that we have well over 10 SART programs by region, and they're getting more and more of them. We just had one start in the Matanuska Valley, which is just north of Anchorage. For years, the local law enforcement and the troopers said that they didn't need a local SART because they could just transport people into Anchorage. But we argued that if you build it, they will come. And a lot of people were choosing not to report in what we call the valley because they would have to be transported in the back of a police car as a victim survivor and to get the treatment that they needed. And now that they have created their own SART program, they're seeing that they actually do have many reports that are coming in. So making it accessible and available. We also have case management and emergency financial assistance that is available for people who have safety needs, maybe emergency relocation, getting a security alarm system, a phone, so that they will be available to be contacted by the detective or by us. We have a lot of follow through with our clients, and we follow the case through the criminal legal system sometimes for years. We are available to go to the DA's interviews with them and provide accompaniment to grand jury, all of the court hearings and jury trial, sentencing, parole hearings. All of our advocates also function as legal advocates. We can help get them connected with legal resources like family law attorneys. We have access to housing vouchers. A number of the people that we work with are homeless at the time that they experienced a sexual assault. So we assist them with obtaining housing vouchers that can help them be safer, and they can live in an apartment for up to 3 years and only have to pay about 30% of their adjusted income towards rent while they get back on their feet. And that has been extremely helpful for people who are experiencing homelessness or whose perpetrator, for example, may have been the primary breadwinner of the family and is incarcerated, and they're rebuilding their lives. We also have a trauma therapist at STAR who is very specialized in sexual trauma, and she really does remarkable work. So,
yeah. As I'm listening to you talk about this process, you have the first touch and you're navigating how someone comes to you to report it, to speak it, which is, again, a process where someone is coming to you to actually reveal something that has been horrifyingly difficult for them to deal with in that moment. And then you take them through the resources that you have, what's available to them. And it's a long process. It's a lengthy process. It's a detailed process. It's a very intense process. And even after you go through the SART process, you still have to deal with the court system and the legal system and all the things that have to do with the reporting with the police officers. This could take years. What do you want people who are listening to understand from, one, the perspective of someone who is facing this, but also society at large? When you are thinking about sexual violence, sexual trauma, and the impact of that, it's so multifaceted and it's such a long-bearing problem. What do you want people to think about so that we can all help ourselves and other people that we care about in organizations like yours navigate it a little bit better?
I think that people need to realize that they don't need to necessarily report or go through the criminal legal system to be able to start their healing journey or to advance their healing journey from wherever they are. We have people who come to us who are experiencing a lot of anxiety and trauma responses as a result of something that happened to them a decade earlier, or maybe as a child, and they're coming to us as an adult, and they may have no interest in reporting. Maybe the offender has even passed away, but there are strategies and tools that can help somebody who has experienced that trauma. It's just a matter of finding someone like our trauma therapist or our advocates who understand and can normalize those trauma responses. And that works with people, whether they're coming to us right after an incident happened or whether it happened when they were a child. And if somebody wants to report, we're going to be their biggest cheerleader and we're going to be there beside them the whole way. But we're never going to be pressing someone to take any action unless they want to take that action. So we really normalize the trauma response, which can include a fear of being in a crowded space. Some people are terrified of leaving their house. They might develop new phobias that they've never experienced before. They might have difficulty sleeping. They may be sleeping all the time. They may not be able to eat. A very common sexual trauma response are stomach aches, sometimes to the point where people are going to the emergency room and the doctor can't find anything wrong with them. But we can normalize that and let them know that's a trauma response. And we talk with them about ways that when they're experiencing that, they might want to call the crisis line so we can talk them through that. I've had people call on the crisis line that are calling from the restroom at their workplace. They're having an anxiety or panic attack because their boss just came up behind them and tapped them on the shoulder. And they had an exaggerated trauma response. They were embarrassed and they didn't want to have to explain themselves. They went to the restroom and they're hyperventilating and they call the crisis line so that we can talk them through that. Talk them through breathing, tapping, whatever kinds of strategies that work for them. And we often ask them, what kind of strategies do you have? Because a lot of times they already do have strategies. It's just a matter of being reminded of it. But we can help infuse some of those as well. We do that in our support groups, and we do that in advocacy sessions, and we do that with our trauma therapists. We often talk about how healing is not a chronological linear journey. It can be full of ups and downs. There are numerous triggers that we want to help people identify so that they're aware of them, because having that knowledge is very powerful in being able to step back and look at things from a different perspective of not, I'm losing my mind, I'm out of control, I don't have any control, to a place where I am in control. I know exactly what triggered me. I know what to do about it. I know how to respond. And that's what we want to do, is to put people in charge of their own trauma responses and help them identify them and gain control.
There's probably a good deal of your population that are people who are coming to you and revealing things that have happened to them in the past. And I think this is a part of the phenomenon of sexual trauma and sexual violence that a lot of people have a very difficult time comprehending. Those of us who have experienced it and who are dealing with it later after it's happened to us in the past. And for those who are around us who were unaware of it, especially if they were in the spaces where these things occurred, there could be some really challenging responses to that. I was wondering if you could speak to people who may be listening to this who may be petrified, frankly, to disclose that, and people who have disclosed it and found that they have not been able to occupy a space of support and agreement with the people who are around them.
We want to be a safe place for anybody to disclose. And oftentimes that's what it takes, is having a tertiary response that is not connected. We're not tied up in the person's life. We can listen, we can be objective, we can be reasonable without emotion. We can help support someone as they disclose and not be concerned that we know the offender. And that's why tertiary assistance, like a domestic violence hotline or a sexual assault hotline or shelter, are oftentimes much more effective than going to a close family friend or family member for assistance, because you can get information and resources and be able to talk with somebody who's not connected with the choices that you make as a result of that conversation. We really want to make sure that people have a confidential and safe resource that they can go to. And maybe it's experimenting with disclosing, right? Maybe it's, I'm not ready to say who the offender was, but I need to talk about the way that I'm feeling and the harm that I've experienced. And that's fine, because we're never pressuring anyone for more information than they're ready to give. A crisis line like that can be an invaluable tool for someone who is looking at experimenting a little bit with how much they disclose, because they're never going to be pressured. And I often tell people as soon as they call, you don't have to give your name. I don't need to know more than what you want to tell me. And I just want to make this a really safe, comfortable space for you to share what you feel like sharing right now. I don't need people to go into a lot of detail for me to be able to normalize their experience from the experiences that I've heard from thousands of survivors. I remember in particular a woman that came to me when she was thinking about talking to law enforcement. I was the first person that she ever told that her adopted father had been abusing her for years from the time that she was tiny. She truly was blaming herself, that she sought him out for attention. And I said, well, shame on him that the only kind of attention that he would give you was this kind of attention. That's not on you. Every child seeks attention from their caregiver. And she said at that time that that was really critical for her to hear, because she had always blamed herself for seeking him out, climbing on his lap, wrapping her arm around him. Every child does that. And it just needed to be normalized in a way that she could separate her need for affection and care as a young child to what awful ramifications he had in store for her. I think that the primary thing that I hear from survivors is shame and self-blame. And when people process trauma on their own without bouncing it off of anyone, it is just cyclical, and it always comes back to blaming oneself. And that can go for any kind of trauma response. Trauma is very polarizing, and you tend to look at things in black and white or on one end or the other. It's very difficult to see the gray spaces in the middle and in between. We always encourage people to share with others to get an objective point of view on their trauma. If they do disclose to someone who is minimizing or not believing them or not supportive or even blaming them, that they seek out someone else that they can talk to, because that is not their fault. That person has their own reasons for the way that they're responding. What I've found time and time again is that person has their own trauma history that they have not processed. So they can't hear or deal with anyone else's. They will tend to deal with other people's trauma in the way that they have dealt with themselves. And if they blame themselves and they really have not dealt with it, they're not going to be able to deal with someone else.
It's interesting because I think that those of us who have this history, we have to make that choice. Are we going to tell the people that we were in relationship with when these things happened, or the people who were in the circle? Are we going to confront the person that did this to us? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There are ramifications for all of those things. But when we do disclose, and the people that we are seeking emotional and sometimes physical shelter from and facing this type of trauma, it can be very disconcerting when the response is less than supportive. We've talked about what you say to folks who have experienced the trauma. What kind of guidance would you give to people who are getting this information and having to confront the fact that something this horrible happened to someone that is in their circle, but are having a really hard time processing it, understanding it, and not being judgmental about it? What are the things that you would like for them to consider so that they can hold the space for people with some compassion and empathy?
We actually offer that as a service as far as providing care to secondary trauma victims, that family members and close friends who are supporting someone are often going to need support themselves. And we offer that as a resource. We are also able to provide space and time where somebody wants to disclose to a parent or a family member about what happened to them, that they have an advocate present with them who is objective. A lot of people will make someone feel guilty about not reporting, or they themselves will feel guilty about not reporting. And we just don't put that on anyone. They may say, well, if I don't report what he did, he could hurt someone else. That's not on you. That is not your responsibility. If you had control over that offender's choices and actions, we wouldn't be sitting here talking. That is not something that you own in any way. And we have young people who are maybe, say, 20, they're underage, they were drinking, and their parent blames them for something that happened at a party. We often have to talk with them about how the natural consequence of being young and drinking too much is a hangover. It's not rape. We will sit in that space and just provide that objectivity and a different perspective on what happened, so that the family member or other person that they're disclosing to doesn't have to carry all of the heavy lifting, that they do have a model on how to respond to someone and to believe them, and that they can call our crisis line and talk about how they might be feeling, because this could be somebody who is their partner that did the harm to their child, and they're torn between allegiances. They may not want to believe what has occurred out of self-protection. And so we want to be a resource and help them understand really what they're having a difficult time with, so that they're not having that conversation with the survivor. They're having that conversation with a neutral party.
I want us to go back to talk about what the impact of sexual trauma is, because I think that people, once they experience it themselves, or once we're adjacent to someone who's had this experience, we don't know what to do. We don't know what to look for. We don't know what the signs are. We don't know how to tend to them. I know that you offer people an understanding of the types of things that might show up, the anxiety, the helplessness, the persistent fears. Can you tell us what that looks like and how it's not a linear process? And can you tell us what you think the people around those folks who are dealing with those things, watching it and trying to care for them, should be aware of, and how to navigate that as well?
People may not react in a way that you would think of from seeing it in movies or on TV. People may be doing everything they can to act as normally as possible, to hold it together. A lot of people would expect folks to be really tearful and crying and upset, and that may not be the response they have. They may be experiencing denial. They may be experiencing dissociation. Dissociation means going away to a safe place in one's mind and not dealing with what's happening. A lot of people who have been sexually assaulted have little to no affect. They can answer the questions that are put to them, but when they don't have the emotion behind it, it can make people who are not experienced in receiving those disclosures doubt them. Oh no, if that happened, she'd be a lot more upset. She'd be at her wit's end. She'd be on the ground, cowering. And that truly is not the most common response. A lot of people, when they have little to no affect, they're just in a state of shock. And that is absolutely to be expected. Some people will not want to discuss it at all. They won't respond to questions and they will isolate themselves. That doesn't mean to say that some are not very tearful and very upset as they're describing what has happened. But for the most part, a lot of folks are just exuding this ultra calm as they're disclosing what occurred. When they're initially calling our crisis line, you can tell that they're testing the waters, especially if it's the first time that they've ever called. They just want to test you a little bit and find out if they're going to be asked a ton of questions, if they're going to be interrogated, if they're going to be believed. We really try to focus on allowing them to tell what they want to tell at their own pace. Some of the signs that people can look for in friends or family members, and in particular, maybe parents of youth or caregivers of youth, would be that repeated stomach ache, stomach pains, stomach cramps, those kinds of things, extremely common. And certainly for child sexual abuse, you would not be surprised by a child that has not had a problem previously suddenly beginning wetting the bed. Difficulty eating or eating a lot, and whether they seem to be eating for self-soothing or for calming, or whether they really have no appetite and they don't want to eat even their favorite foods. Not wanting to play, not wanting to be around someone in particular, being avoiding of going somewhere that they seem to not have a problem with before might indicate where they were harmed or who harmed them. And the same could be said for an adult, avoiding situations that will remind them of the harm that occurred. It's very common for adults in particular to develop agoraphobia, where they want to stay in, they want to stay in their home, they're afraid to go out. They don't want to ride on any kind of public transportation. They don't want to go to the grocery store. They don't want to be in public. That is a very common trauma response related to sexual assault. We try to normalize that exaggerated trigger response, like where somebody jumps when someone touches them on the shoulder. And we always do this as well at our office when people come into one of our intake rooms for a meeting. We allow them to sit where they want, pick the chair that feels most comfortable to them. And 9 times out of 10, they're going to pick the chair that's up against the wall where they can see the door. And you know who else does that? Cops, because they are always cognizant of wanting to be in control of their surroundings and know that nobody can come up behind them. And so we just use that as a tool to break the ice. I notice where you sat really puts you in a position where you are not vulnerable. And it's important for people to realize some of their unconscious choices and things that they're doing. Again, just trying to have people understand what those responses look like so that they can help identify major changes in behaviors, especially of youth, where it's your job to protect them. If you can identify that, boy, their personality just seems to have shifted, well, ask them what happened. Talk with them.
As a part of your services, at some point you say to them, we've gotten through this so you can identify these things, and then we're going to move you to this. So tell me what it looks like to move from identifying the response to the sexual trauma to navigating it. It happened. We've taken you through the paces and you figured out if you're going to report it, if you're not going to report it, but you're on this healing journey. You have confronted it. You have acknowledged it. You're trying to figure out how to make sense of it in your life. And then
I think it's very individual to every single person, whether they feel in control of the narrative and whether they feel like selectively disclosing to those people in their lives that they feel like they would benefit from disclosing to. So some people feel like with a romantic partner that they need to share that information. Some people don't because they're afraid of being more vulnerable, and really allowing them to be in control of those kinds of choices that they make. There is no wrong way to go about recognizing that as something that has happened to them and acknowledging that it is a part of their life, but that it is no longer controlling them, that they are in control of the path they are on.
Yeah, I love that, because I think what you're articulating is there's no right way to do this. And what your organization and your advocates are constantly doing is giving people the resources to figure it out. I know we talked about this a little bit, but I do think it's really important that people consider how we can really be of greatest support to survivors. It's a sticky situation, because I think when I talked with Blaze, she said there are a lot of things that people tried to do that were really great. And then there are some things that they did that just seemed to enable bad behavior with me, because they just simply did not know what to do. And so I want you to impart the healthiest ways that people can try to support survivors in a way that's beneficial to the survivor, but also in a way that allows them to be compassionate without becoming enmeshed.
Well, I think first and foremost, start by believing anyone who comes forward to disclose harm. Acknowledge the bravery and the courage of someone disclosing harm to you, and acknowledge that you must be a person of significant trust in their lives. Feel the honor and the privilege of holding that space, and recognize the importance that your response means to that person if they're choosing to tell you something so personal and intimate. And to not press someone in a direction, avoid anything that is not completely centered on the person who is disclosing. Make sure that it is completely centered on them, and that they're not being pushed in any particular direction of what to do. Make sure that you thank them for sharing, and that you explore with them what they hope to gain by disclosing. What are some of the goals that they might have about telling you, and how can you be of support and help? There's no rule saying that you can't ask the person what they need and then do what they need. You don't have to be guessing. You can just ask. And sometimes that response is, I don't know, I just needed to share. Then that's enough. Oftentimes just sharing will make somebody feel a lot better, a little more lighthearted, just to be able to get that weight of the world off their shoulders that they've been carrying alone, and to share that burden. There really is no rule that there's something that you have to do. I often tell folks when they disclose to me, say at our office, keep in mind that this may come up at 3:00 in the morning, and you don't want to bother your best friend that you've disclosed to, who is your support system. That's when you can call the crisis line. We're available 24/7. Call us, talk it out. People might be experiencing night terrors, or they might just be having insomnia. And so calling in the middle of the night, if you do that with a friend or a family member and over again, it's exhausting to them. That's why we want to be a resource for people to call anytime that they need to.
Let's pivot to prevention, my favorite part of this, because we want to stop this.
Mine too.
Right? Let's get to the prevention. I know you do it in a couple of areas: youth education presentations, you have adult education and professional training, and then just educational and informational booths. So talk to me about those three areas and why it's so important to target in that way so we can educate for prevention.
We want to challenge a lot of misunderstandings and beliefs about sexual assault. We want to make sure that people are informed of what the real risks and hazards are, that they understand that generally somebody who is doing this harm is known to the victim. It's not a random stranger that is jumping out, attacking someone at knife point or with a gun. It's often an acquaintance or somebody that is known to the victim, including somebody who is a family member or maybe a current or former partner. The more that we can educate our community, the more educated we will find jurors to be in criminal trials. We want to make sure that people are able to respond to those around them who have been harmed. We want people to understand that men are sexual assault survivors, that child sexual abuse happens, that it is actually quite prevalent here in Alaska, and that just by being a child in Alaska, your risk of harm is 6 times higher than any other state in the nation. So
Wait, repeat that again.
Just by being a child in Alaska, potential for child sexual abuse is 6 times higher than any other state in the nation. So we want people to understand those statistics and that we have such a high rate of rape here in Alaska that is nearly 4 times higher than anywhere else in the nation. We want people to understand those statistics so that information is armor.
Before we get into the information being armor, is there a particular causality with regard to the 6 times the child rate in the nation that is making Alaska so much more prominent in this space?
Not anything that we can specifically put our finger to, but if we look at the rates of children who are being removed from the home, who are going into foster care, that have experienced neglect, abuse, sexual violence, and being in homes where there's the manufacturing of drugs. We look at all of those rates, they're higher in Alaska than they are in any other state in the nation.
So then when we get to the point of youth education and presentations, one of the things that I discovered when I had my pre-interview with you is how young you are going.
We have been collaborating with the Anchorage School District from the inception of STAR 42 years ago, but we have very much formalized our collaboration in the last decade. All of our prevention and education presentations to youth are age appropriate, development appropriate, customized to the age ranges. We start in kindergarten. We focus primarily in kindergarten to 6th grade. We also have presentations for middle school and high school. We have an office on the university and provide presentations to university students, faculty, and staff. Our kindergarten through 6th grade presentations are based on just personal body safety, body autonomy, understanding that my body is my own and no one else has a right to harm it or touch me without my consent. So we talk about how no one should touch a child in the areas that their swimming suit covers, and we identify those as private areas. I think a lot of people think that we're talking about really scary things and sexualizing things for kids when we talk about child sexual abuse prevention. And it's not scary, and all the kids understand it. We talk about how an adult should only touch you in those areas for health and safety and keeping you clean. We talk about who might someone be that would touch you in that area. Maybe my mommy when I'm in the bath, or maybe a doctor if I were hurt. Okay, doctors, great. What about a dentist? And the kids laugh because they realize that no, a dentist shouldn't touch you in those areas. So it's really not scary, but it's also not intuitive. And a lot of parents and caregivers don't know how to talk with their children about personal body safety. We help them identify 5 trusted adults, only 2 of which can be in the home, that they would tell if they were being harmed, 3 people outside of their home that they could go to if they felt unsafe. We talk about the no-go tell rule, that if someone is invading their space, that they say no in a loud voice, that they go away as fast as they can, and they tell.
Okay, we got the no-go tell rule. By the way, as I'm listening to you, I didn't have any of these. Nobody taught me this ever. Never. And so I think about also when you say the 5 trusted adults, 3 outside the home, the no-go tell rule, and the fact that you're saying, I think when a lot of adults think about us getting to this particular population and having this conversation, they think we're teaching them the scary stuff and we're saying things that are explicit and too much for them. But this is really the simple stuff that you're trying to get them to understand so that they can also aid in the trusted adults who are caring for them to understand this too. How do adults generally respond to the types of resources you're providing with their kids?
We get overwhelmingly positive feedback from parents. Thank you for bringing this up to my kids. We have customized that training so that we can share it with parents through the school district at parent nights. We want them to have a common language so that they understand what their children are learning so that they can be prepared if their children need to talk with them. We ideally would like to be doing parenting classes when folks are expecting a child so that they, from the very beginning of parenting, understand that they need to talk with their children early and often using these prevention strategies so their children know that they can talk with their parents about it. We focus on the fact that it's incredibly protective just to talk to the kids about it and make sure that the other adults around the child know that the child has been talked to. That way it creates a community of care and concern for the child. Everybody's using the same common language. And even if there were a predator in the mix of that community around the child, they would know that child has been talked to, knows what to do, knows that they will tell. And so that child is protected. That predator would not harm that child because they know that they would get caught. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
In middle school, we're talking about healthy relationships and healthy boundaries. That really is focused on friendships. And in high school, we're talking about consent and sexual assault, and really introducing that topic and what it means. And as I said, in college, we're really talking about bystander intervention strategies and what they might do if a friend discloses to them any harm and how they will support them.
So then when we get to adult education and professional training, what does that look like?
We do a lot of sexual harassment and implicit bias and those kinds of trainings for everything from corporations to unions to church groups. We do mandatory reporter training so that people know how to respond in an appropriate fashion to a child disclosing harm to them so that they know exactly what steps to take, how to support that child. We actually have a contract with NOAA. We have the largest marine fisheries program in the United States. We have the largest coastline. We have the largest fisheries. Part of commercial fishing industries is that they put fish biologists on the boat to monitor the fishermen, and they have to report when they violate some rule, which is a position, as you can imagine, that is ripe for harassment. And so we have a contract with NOAA that if anyone is harmed in the fisheries or if they are being harassed, that they can reach out to STAR. And we can even transport them out of a dangerous situation and get them to Anchorage for assistance or help to relocate them to get them safer. We work with the National Park Service. Again, we have more parks in Alaska than in the rest of the United States. So there are situations where people are very isolated, may not have access to communications and frequently co-ed. And we want to make sure that we're a resource to those folks that are working out in our national parks as well.
You also do a bystander intervention, which I think is so critical about this work. How do you advise bystanders to intervene when witnessing an incident? I know that it's complicated when it's in an interpersonal space or a workspace. So what kinds of advice and what kind of strategies do you offer there?
We tend to use Green Dot as a bystander intervention tool. Our prevention and education staff provide trainings to local bars on university campuses where there's a closed community of staff or of students and faculty, and in schools. We interweave those prevention strategies into all of our presentations. We talk with folks about how they can cause a diversion. If there's something going on, we want them to feel comfortable and safe in whatever kind of response that they have, whether it is directly confronting the person or creating a diversion or calling law enforcement. We interweave it with all of our presentations, talking with youth in high school about sexual assault and consent and healthy relationships and boundaries.
In the work that you do, you're dealing with high incidence of crisis, intervention, and trauma all the time. What do you do and what do you encourage your team to do to take care of yourselves?
We encourage our staff to share with one another what they're feeling, to talk through the different cases. We encourage anyone who is hearing a disclosure, especially in detail, to call someone else on their team and discuss it immediately, to get that off their chest, to not be carrying it around while they've been working at home. That's been a challenge because there's not really a distinction between their home and their workplace. And having the crisis line in their home, they have to have a private place where they can talk. We often talk about setting up a certain location in the home where they do that work and where they have Zoom conferences and meetings about work and individual support sessions with their clients, and that they leave that there and have a separation. Pre-pandemic, it was very much the same thing. Leave work at the workplace and have a clear distinction and separation from your private life in your home. Find things that you enjoy and really let off some steam. It's very similar to what we would talk through with our clients about healing, is to find that passion, find that joy and the things that you really enjoy doing, and do those things when you're not at work. If I start recognizing in myself that I'm not having the same enjoyment from those things, then that is a sign of vicarious trauma. If I'm not reaching out to my coworkers, my colleagues for help that I need, that is a sign of vicarious trauma. If I'm tending to see things a lot more negatively, then those are signs that I need to reach out to my counselor, and I need to work through why I'm starting to see things either in a more polarizing way or whether I'm seeing things more on the negative side. We definitely encourage folks to use our employee assistance program, where they can get free counseling services. We offer good benefits for our staff to be able to make sure that they are staying healthy and that they have therapy as often as they may want to seek it. And we dedicate 1 week every quarter to wellness. We call it Wellness Week. And the whole week is dedicated to different strategies around wellness.
What should our core value be around sexual trauma as a nation?
I mean, it truly is based in our culture. And we're making some progress, I think, in the area of recognizing toxic masculinity, and really strict gender stereotypes are very damaging and really put people in boxes. That boys will be boys. You have the excuses that are made for men who subject women to sexual harassment, people who don't believe women when they come forward. We've seen that with Kavanaugh, with Cuomo, with President Trump, when it was disclosed that grabbing them by their private places, that's just locker room talk. Like, that would be acceptable in a locker room, and it's not. We need to fight those areas of toxic masculinity. I think President Biden focusing on sexual violence and sexual harassment in the military is definitely a population that has been affected by toxic masculinity. Questions about what did women expect going into the military, that wouldn't happen. All of that has to be challenged from the top down. It's high time that the Equal Rights Amendment was ratified. Why has that been on the table for so long and just pushed aside and rarely talked about? We need to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. We need to understand that, along with toxic masculinity, that strict gender stereotypes are harmful across the board, and accept that our transgendered brothers and sisters are being harmed by that as well. They are highly overrepresented as victims of sexual violence and general violence and homicide, all coming down to gender stereotyping and what we expect of men and women. We are making some progress culturally in that direction, but it's causing a lot of harm still.
Are there other national or local policy imperatives we should be thinking about with regard to law enforcement, how the hospitals and medicine are dealing with this, court systems? Are there things that we should be thinking about?
I know locally, something that we're working on and really prioritizing this year in our legislative session is the definition of consent. It is completely outdated, and what we have in Alaska is really a definition of what it means to be without consent. There's not been an affirmative definition of consent in the state, and that makes it extremely difficult and really raises the bar for what prosecution has to be able to prove. We have higher standards for our prosecutors in this state. When we have the highest rates of sexual violence in the nation, it's really high time to consider that we need to have a better definition of consent. The newer definition really covers a wide variety of things, but that it be affirmative, that it take into consideration that it doesn't matter if there was a former dating relationship or intimate relationship between the parties, or if they are married. It doesn't matter what the person was wearing, and that someone who is intoxicated can't consent. So there's a wide variety of problematic issues that we see here in Alaska that are covered by the new definition of consent. The former definition of without consent really required that there be some sort of force used for a sexual assault to occur. force or threat of harm or kidnapping is really what it came down to. So we've worked to broaden that definition so it includes deceit or fraud, even that if somebody is tricking you to believing that you're someone you're not. It takes into consideration sexual assault hidden as part of professional service. So that kind of gets to, if we think of the many gymnasts on the US team that were violated by a doctor who had convinced them that this treatment was a legitimate treatment and not sexual abuse. So we're really trying to emphasize that bill, which is HB 5 here in Alaska, really trying to get it prioritized for hearing and really optimistic that it could pass in this session. So I think that consent laws throughout the United States really have to be looked at. There are many states that are redefining consent because the antiquated way of looking at consent was really based on what the sexual predator knew and when he knew it. And it really didn't take into consideration someone being unable to consent because they were incapacitated, often at the hands of the offender, and really getting away from the old notion of sexual assault as something that happens in a dark alley by a stranger with a weapon. Very, very rarely the case.
What are the ways in which, in your organization specifically, you engage volunteers? If you could also apply that more broadly to how organizations that function in the way that you do across the country might be open, that folks who are listening to this from afar can also think, these are the things I might want to consider.
In our organization, we have a board of directors who are all volunteers from our local community that help with the leadership of the agency and make sure that we are financially stable. We have volunteers who help out in the office who don't have access to anything that is confidential, but help with filing and different things that don't have anything to do with our client services. We have interns from the university that are trained every year, and they come in, they help with our prevention and education department. They host booths and provide brochures and information to the community, answer questions. Some of them get trained to actually do prevention presentations. We have volunteers who fundraise for us and volunteers who help with special events that we host. We have an annual gala every year, and we sometimes have hundreds of volunteers that assist with that. And we have people in the community who are supporters who do fundraising online through their social media, where they do Facebook funds and things where they encourage their friends to support our agency. And you can do that certainly anywhere in the nation. Call your local rape crisis center and find out what kinds of donations they need. We have a list on our website so people can do clothing drives, for example. We're always taking donations of new sweats, t-shirts, bras, underwear, socks, and different kinds of food items we can provide to our clients. In a very particular way to STAR, we train community members to be crisis line responders on the statewide sexual assault crisis line. Anyone who comes through STAR that has any contact on the crisis line have background checks. They go through a very intense training. We sometimes have people that weed themselves out. They're either too close to their own experience to be effective helping others, and they recognize that as they go through the training. And we tell everybody who goes through our training that is the greatest strength that they can show, is recognizing in themselves that they're not going to be effective helping others, that they have some processing to do. On our crisis line, we have therapists, counselors, university professors who are really engaged in social services. We have former law enforcement officers and such a broad variety of people that work on our crisis line. We have 39 crisis line responders. Some of them have been working on the crisis line over 20 years. They've been involved with the agency for that long, and they're truly remarkable. They answer the crisis line on weekends and holidays and after hours. We couldn't manage without them. That certainly gives all of our staff a break to be able to really be off during those times. But also it creates emissaries to the community. All of those people have other jobs. A number of them are involved in community organizations, social service organizations, or churches, and they are helping to educate the rest of the community about what sexual violence is and what trauma arises from it. They can help break down barriers, make sure that people are aware of the crisis line, are aware of the prevention presentations that we're able to do. And so if there is an opportunity in someone's community to volunteer in that regard, that's incredibly helpful. You talked with Blaze Bell, who has volunteered to be a speaker at some of our events, which were maybe her first few opportunities to present to a live audience about what happened. And look at her now as far as sharing her experience, and just such a powerful person. But she is helping serve survivors and helping people in recovery, really taking a tremendously horrible experience and using it for the good to help others. And a lot of our staff and our crisis line responders are coming from that same experience and giving back. I would say for any survivor who wanted to share their story and help others, to reach out to their local rape crisis center or RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, and they have volunteers that speak on the national level. They also have a crisis line that is the national hotline for anyone to call who's experienced any of those issues. There are a number of ways that you can volunteer or fundraise or donate to help further these programs that are really just there to help survivors.
Keeley Olson, Executive Director of STAR, Standing Together Against Rape, thank you for your commitment to sexual trauma prevention and response, and thank you for Amplifying America.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been very special.
Healing from sexual trauma is a daunting task. Eden Lunsford is a licensed professional counselor in private practice who has been working professionally with trauma since 1993. I spoke with her about the nature of trauma, the therapies that can be helpful, and how it is possible to heal from it.
My name is Eden Lunsford. I'm the licensed professional counselor at a nonprofit organization here in Anchorage, Alaska, who serves individuals that have been through sexual trauma and are survivors of the impacts of that.
Tell me about trauma therapy. What is it?
Trauma therapy is a specific approach to therapy that recognizes and emphasizes how the traumatic experience impacts a person's physical, emotional, spiritual, and relational well-being.
Who would you say, outside of the clients that you see through the organization you work for, trauma therapy is for?
Trauma is pretty universal in every culture. It doesn't discriminate. It could be sexual trauma, such as I work with. I also work with survivors of all types of violent crimes. It's not just those types of events that cause trauma. A person who's gone through the loss of a child, a person who's gone through a significant medical situation is also impacted by trauma. Also, an individual who has been witness to those things is impacted by trauma. Yeah. All of those things have an effect on our physical being, our emotional well-being, and our ability to relate with others.
Why is this type of therapy important?
Because the effects of these traumatic events oftentimes will last decades beyond when that actual event happened. And that impacts those relationships that are important to us, our health, our ability to show up in different situations that we want to engage in a healthy way.
When do you introduce someone to trauma therapy? What are you seeing when you are engaging someone and you're like, I think this person could benefit from trauma therapy?
Well, specifically, the organization I work with, those individuals have already recognized they've been through something that is very impactful, and it has changed how they feel about being in this world, their sense of safety in all these different regards. An individual who is at a place where they're ready to talk about something, or they're ready to address some of the ways that these things are having long-lasting effects in their life, that's an individual that I would say is ready to engage in therapy.
I know there are various types of trauma therapies. Could you share what the different types of trauma therapies are and which ones would be expressly good for people who have experienced sexual violence?
There's all sorts of different approaches to treating PTSD or sexual trauma. The ones that people are familiar with and the ones that we tend to gravitate towards as therapists are those evidence-based approaches. That prolonged exposure is a type of therapy, and there's cognitive processing therapy. There's somatic experiencing therapies, specific somatic experience. EMDR is a phenomenal one. And then there's also brain spotting, which evolved from EMDR. That's also very effective. As far as what types of therapy I recommend is those types of therapy that are acknowledging of the neurobiological effects of the trauma, meaning that we don't just talk about that this is a terrible experience I've been to. We recognize where that has taken its toll and its effect on the neurobiology of our body.
Can you break down the difference between cognitive, somatic, and trauma therapies? When you talk about neurobiology, can you break that down so that they can understand it?
I guess the first part of that would be cognitive therapies or those type of therapies where we can think about how we're thinking. We can recognize I tend to be late for things. So I'm going to start to address the behaviors around being late. I need to get up earlier. We can see a fairly linear pattern to how it is we need to change that. It is not a linear way when we're working with trauma because sometimes it doesn't make sense. We don't need to know what it is to know that it is. And that's the wisdom that comes out of working with brain spotting specifically, in that we can talk about an experience that you've had and recognize that, gosh, when I think about that situation, it makes my chest feel really heavy. And that sort of recognition is part of that somatic experience with a trauma that tells us that information that, I'm thinking about this thing, but it's making my body feel this certain kind of way when I think about it. So that's the somatic experience that goes with the trauma that shows, and it's really evidence that it isn't just stored in our brain. It's not just there in our memory. It's literally contained in our whole nervous system. We have our neocortex, which is that thinking part of our brain, that more cognitive behavioral part of our brain. And we've got the subcortex of our brain. And that's the stuff that we don't even know that's necessarily there. It's connected more to our limbic system. And our limbic system is really the part that gets activated continually over time as these traumas show up in our life long after the trauma itself is past.
Interesting. So when you're engaging clients who are coming to you with active trauma that they're trying to get over, how do you assess what type of trauma therapy you would apply to their particular situation?
It really depends on where a client is in their process. Some people find that they really just want to talk about it, to try and process it in that kind of way. And that's really important for them to put together their story in that way. But when it comes specifically to trauma, I try to direct somebody more towards the direction of either EMDR, somatic experiencing, or brain spotting, because those types of therapy really address where it is stored in your body and allows your body to reprocess that in a very short amount of time and to get significant changes and differences in how you're experiencing your world.
When should someone consider trauma therapy? Because I think people experience traumas in life all the time. Some traumas don't live inside of people in a significant way. Some people, it doesn't have a huge impact on them. Other people, it affects them greatly. When you think about how people talk about or interact with the space of trauma, for folks who really can get over these things very quickly, there's a lack of patience for folks who can't. So there are two things that I want you to address. The first thing is, what do you want people to understand about the weight and gravity of trauma on a continuum? And the second part is, when should somebody consider trauma therapy?
You hit the nail right on the head. People experience those experiences in different ways. As far as those people who are affected by trauma, we could have 100 people go through a traumatic experience, and maybe 10 to 20% of those people might experience traumatic symptoms that become intrusive to them. And so what does that mean? It means that an experience can happen and we have this processing time where your body's trying to figure out what to do with what just happened and your brain's doing this stuff. But when those symptoms start to linger and they've lingered beyond a month, somewhere in that time frame, we start looking at it as not just being that they experienced a traumatic event. Now they quite possibly have PTSD, and that looks like a person having intrusive symptoms and re-experiencing of different things. That could be nightmares, that could be panic attacks, that could be a ruminating thought that they can't pull from their mind, that they can't really get away from. It could look like avoidance. They're wanting to avoid people, places, different sensory input. They tend to have like an alteration in their mood or in their symptoms of arousal, where they find themselves just becoming really hypervigilant from a sound or from somebody brushing against them. Those are what we call symptoms, and they are disruptive. They impact our personal lives, our ability to work. And this is where it really starts to be something we need to address. It's not a linear path. A person could be seemingly doing pretty fine, and then something comes along and they find themselves triggered, and it makes them feel like they're 20 steps back from how far they've come. Having patience with an individual, that is just tremendous to just even say, to just have patience with your loved ones and those people around you who've been through something really significant. Being an understanding person, like I said, it's that unconditional positive regard component where that person is like, oh, okay, so I can look at you as a resource in this circumstance and get that support. When we have life experiences, it really does change the actual structure of our brain.
When we have traumatic life experiences.
Yes.
I want people to understand what the impact of having a traumatic life experience actually does to them.
On an actual biological level, we can see this stuff plainly on fMRIs, that a traumatic experience actually changes the structures in your brain.
What's an fMRI?
It's a special type of an MRI, which is able to read images in such a way that it picks up on where blood flow is happening, what's happening in the brain when a person has been through this. It's a more in-depth MRI. It impacts our mind in the way that our emotions have been affected. It affects our arousal. It affects our behavior. I mean, these are things that we can want them to be different, but that our brain is literally different than it used to be. So addressing it in a full system kind of a way, we have to look at it as being more than just in our brain and how it's impacting our body and the way it's reacting to things that are happening around it. All of those things are long-term effects of trauma.
With sexual violence in particular, as well as domestic violence, the violences that are physical in nature, it is a very visceral experience, and it is something that's felt physically in your body. You spoke a little bit earlier about that notion of physical safety. In what ways do the types of therapies that are offered to trauma survivors help people square up getting back to that sense of peace and safety within, not just in their heads, but also physically?
Well, it really has to do with that relational component that they have with their therapist. It takes very special training to be able to do trauma therapy. When you're sitting with somebody and they're sharing about this horrible experience, so many people want to rush and kind of go, oh, but you're okay now. Or look at you, you survived it. And that's really not necessarily honoring of that person's experience. If we're trying to rush them through it, we need to allow them to process it the way they need to, hold that space with them, however they need us to do it. And most importantly, it's that relational attunement with your client. The most powerful work comes from individuals when they feel that level of rapport and safety with their therapist. You can really accomplish anything if you feel that sense that your therapist is not trying to rush you through this, that they are with you. They're going to hold that space for as long as you need them to. They believe you. And they're in for the long haul. They don't look at you as being broken. They look at you as somebody who has survived something significant. And here you are showing up, showing the courage and that bravery to step into hard things. So that's important in a person's ability to make progress in therapy.
I don't think that people really get the extent to which dealing with trauma is an invisible thing that they don't see, but it has huge impacts on the mind and the body of the person who is experiencing it, but it also has a huge impact on the ecosystem in which they operate, because they're now trying to navigate a space in a particular way through the trauma lens until they get some kind of help that may help them navigate that space a little bit better. I really don't think that people understand, because it's not a broken leg. It is not a heart attack. It is not a brain aneurysm. I don't think that they understand what it looks like for somebody to be operating from a trauma brain space, and that the trauma brain is not just what you're thinking. It is also about what your body is doing.
Absolutely. It actually impacting the structures in our brain, the molecules that are in our brain. From that moment on, this will affect your thinking. This is going to affect behavior. This is going to affect the whole emotional system of this individual. Our brains are kind of set up for learning. It wants to learn. It's modern in the way that it loves new, novel information. We learn best when we're able to let our brain get excited about learning. But trauma impacts it in the way of it becomes more conservative, in the way that it's feeling fearful of learning new information or engaging in new things because it doesn't feel safe, whether it be physically safe, emotionally safe, spiritually safe, or relationally. Those things were all impacted by their trauma. For them to find safety in those things again is how we are able to start growing and thriving. But we can't do that without appropriate therapy, without therapy that's addressing all the effects of the trauma, not just the thinking part, the cognitive part, because there's so much more to it.
For someone who has had this experience in your work, what does relief look like? Is complete relief from that even possible?
Yes, it is. It absolutely is. A person who has engaged in therapy and decided to start working with a therapist on all the ways that this is affecting them, we first get them savvy at using their tools so that they start gaining confidence in their ability to self-regulate again. Here's your body system reacting in all kinds of ways that I don't want to be feeling like I can't be here right now, but here we are. I feel like I can't breathe and my heart's beating out of my chest and I need to get out of here. We don't want to feel that way. By engaging in therapy and choosing one of these modalities with your therapist, success can look like, I never thought I could travel, or I've been having this rumination of nightmares for the last 5 years since my incident. I go to sleep and there's these horrible, scary animals that are coming at me. That's really affects a person's life and their ability to even feel safe in their bedroom or with their spouse. Healing can look like, I'm able to sleep in my bedroom again. I'm able to sleep again. Wow, I feel okay hanging out in my front yard. I haven't felt comfortable being in my front yard in years. Things that don't sound like big deal things for somebody who hasn't been through trauma, but it's gaining an area of their life back that they didn't previously have or think they could have back.
That's really powerful. What tools are you providing your clients with so that they can have those success metrics?
The very first time that we have a session together, I like to send them with something that they can use right away. There's the 4 square breathing, that four breath in, hold for 4, breathing out for 4. Just doing that on repeat. That's a wonderful one. I'm a huge fan of harnessing what's happening in the brain. There's some very specific things that happen when we're triggered that feel really rotten inside of us when we're feeling triggered. Our heart starts to beat really hard. Our breath changes. Our mouth goes dry. All those sort of things are happening. It's like, why is this happening? Well, your body's trying to tell you something. There's some very important information in your environment that you need to pick up on, and it's really trying to get you to pay attention to it. So in those moments, what I like to do is talk to a client about the fact that quite literally, when your brain becomes triggered, that frontal lobe goes offline. It's a primitive design because we really don't need to be worrying about existential crisis when we're actually being triggered, where our body is concerned for our actual safety. So that's when the occipital part of our brain, the base part of our brain takes over, and some really cool stuff happens when that occurs. Your body releases a whole bunch of hormones, which make it so that every one of your senses that you have, your sight, your sound, your smell, all 5 of your senses are actually amped up and are 150% more powerful than they are normally. That's one of the skills and tools I like to send people out with right from the beginning. So when we are triggered, if we harness that ability, we really take in that sight, sound, smell, Is that smell safe? Whatever I'm seeing in front of me, is that safe? Does that sound safe? And once your body goes through this checklist and it recognizes all the input that's there, and you're able to check mark off if these different things are safe, your whole nervous system goes, thank you so much for checking. And the whole system kind of powers down. And we're able to be present in that moment again because we know for sure we're safe. But it doesn't want to turn off. It doesn't want to turn off at all until we've actually checked. And that's really one of the skills I like to teach right out the gate.
What does a win look like for you when you are working with a client and there's some progression being made and then they're like, okay, I think I'm ready to face the world again? And how does that make you feel as a practitioner?
A win to me looks like a client experiencing success in an environment that they hadn't previously been able to feel successful in. That can look in all kinds of ways. That could be a matter of being able to set a boundary with a loved one that you haven't previously been able to do. And then we build off of that experience. It can look all kinds of different ways. Sometimes it might be just like, I was invited to this thing. People are expecting me to be there. I would like to be there, but I've had a really rough week. And then maybe being able to say, I'm going to give myself grace today. I'm just going to go ahead and say, I regret I won't be able to make it, but I really am so thankful you guys invited me, but I need to be in this space right now. Sometimes it's relationally where they're like, oh my gosh, I went to a thing and this person came over and started talking to me and he's really handsome. He seems really cool. We exchanged numbers and I noticed as I was walking away, I was blushing and I didn't feel triggered by that experience. That was amazing. When I first got in the place, I really hoped that I could be safe in this environment, and it made it possible for me to experience this other thing, which I might not have gotten to do.
Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of the wins come in the space of how to re-engage a space where they feel safe interacting with other people. Given the statistic that Keeley shared with me about the number of people who actually know the people who have committed that act of violence against them, how you reorient to be in those spaces with people that they know or social situations that they were once familiar with, that they felt comfortable being in, that in some ways have betrayed them. How are you finding that you're guiding people back into the spaces that they actually have to occupy? Because it's people that they're related to, or it's a job situation, or it's a social situation. How are you arming them with the skills to get back into those spaces?
Well, there's a lot of components that go with that. Sometimes we have family that is able to hear the things that we have to say, and sometimes we don't. Having to go back into a space where there might be somebody who has been a perpetrator before, those are really tough circumstances. I implore for a client to have somebody in the family they trust, that they have as a support. Sometimes it has to do with being able to go, okay, we really would love it if you showed up, but I understand if you don't feel comfortable coming. This individual is expected to show up around 3. I think it would be great if you stop by at around 1, and then we can spend some time together. If you want to take off after that, you're welcome to do that. Or some other manner of safety and protection that that person can depend on within that environment. That they're not a circumstance where they have to be alone with this individual at any point, that there's lots of supportive people around. And those environments is what I look to try to connect the client to if they have to go to those things.
Does your work ever include bringing that support cast into the therapeutic relationship to have those conversations?
I try not to. On occasion, I will have an individual that shows up with their mom or their best friend or their sister. And for them, they're needing that support person there as they come into this one situation where they may have to talk about this traumatic experience they've been through. They don't know if I'm safe yet. And so the support person acts as somebody who can help them in those circumstances. And I fully support them bringing somebody maybe for that first session. But I also find that the client, once they get some time with me and once they recognize that I'm not going to push them to go further than they're ready to go, I'm not going to be digging into their past. There's no shame bombing going to happen in here. This is absolutely a safe place for you to be. Then they usually ask their support person to leave pretty quickly because they want to be able to talk fully about what they want to talk about. And even the support person can't hear it all. Oftentimes, those are things that they even shield some of their support people from. The therapeutic space becomes a place where they can hold these conversations and talk about these deeper things that have been going on for them. They don't have to worry about judgment, which maybe the support person isn't usually judgy or anything like that. But there's things that we spare those close people to us from.
So with that, what advice would you give to someone who is caring for a loved one or a friend who has been through the trauma of sexual violence? They may not have the tools to be effective, but they definitely have good intentions and wanting to be supportive and loving. What kind of advice do you offer those who are on the outskirts of this, who feel helpless and want to do something to support these folks?
Oh, I definitely encourage them to connect with my organization. We serve people who are direct survivors and those people who were impacted by trauma. And people who were peripheral individuals in that situation, they're very much impacted by a trauma. Maybe they felt really helpless. Maybe they felt really overwhelmed. Maybe they didn't know the right things to say. So I encourage them to come to STAR. Please come to STAR. Please talk to an advocate. Call our crisis line because these services are here for you too. But most importantly, to support this person in navigating those big feelings that they're going to be experiencing by being a support person. Like, yeah, that is significant and that does count. And it's okay if you don't know what to say. That's okay. Sometimes just encouraging them to not say anything if they don't know what to say. Sometimes just being there, being that unconditional positive regard for an individual who's been through something is absolutely everything that they need. Leave the therapy to the therapists and connect them to those organizations that can help them, specifically somebody trained in trauma, in those somatic modalities that really will make a difference very quickly for them.
So what do you see as a win in your work? It is challenging for you to be on the front lines of dealing with people's traumas, especially around something so remarkably huge as sexual violence. What are the wins you see in the work that you do?
People are regaining parts of their life back, being able to connect to parts of their life that they just weren't able to for a long time. People who used to do art and they've been through trauma. That's one of the parts of us that we're not able to necessarily connect to, that artistic place inside of us when we don't feel safe. As far as order of operations, artistic ability, creativity, all those types of things, they are not very high on your brain's priority list when you're experiencing a lot of trauma and trauma symptoms. Even somebody starting to draw again, being able to sing again, who was like, oh, I just pulled out my old violin or something like that, is just so amazing and beautiful. Somebody being able to spend time with their kid and just be with them without fear and looking over their shoulder the whole time, where they're able to just be present. That's what trauma really robs us of, is the moments we have right now. The trauma has been gone or passed years and years ago, but those lingering effects of this past experience, they're still present in our body. That's what we're working on with trauma therapy, is allowing those stored reactions to be reprocessed so a person can be present in their life and they can start to imagine a future that is completely different than anything they'd ever even imagined before and better than anything they'd ever even hoped for. That's what we bring back for a client, finding hope again, believing that things can be different, connecting to themselves and those people that they really care about around them. That's what it's really about.
What do you want people to know about the tenacity of sexual violence survivors and the type of work you do to help them regain their power and control back over their lives?
That resilience is in all of us that have been through something horrific, something terrible, something that has changed our lives forever. Connecting to that resilience is part of the journey with therapy. For individuals who are supporting somebody, it's really important for people to know that they don't have to have the answers. They don't have to know the right thing to say, that unconditional positive regard piece is some of the most important things that a person can do for somebody, and letting them know it's a safe place to be with you. There is another way. People do heal. It does get better, and it's possible. Even if it feels impossible, it absolutely is.
Eden Lunsford, for the way that you help people who are striving to survive unspeakable traumas thrive again. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for Amplifying America.
You're welcome. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Now, I invite you to explore how this issue hits home where you live. Visit the Engage page on amplifyamerica.com and download the Amplify America social card template. Fill it out and share what meaningful actions you will engage to combat this issue in your community. And tell me about it by posting on social media using the hashtags Amplify America, Amplify Action, and Amplifier. Together, let's amplify America. Amplify America's sound engineer is Alexander Wojciechowski, and our production intern is Kaya Karibi-White. Special thanks to Carl Jenkins for gifting production support. Thanks for listening.